Hi everyone, this is Balazs from RacingBrick. A lot of you asked me for another 1/8 scale Rebrickable rebuild, so here we go. The latest car in LEGO's 1/8 scale lineup is the Koenigsegg Sadar Spear. You've already seen it featured in quite a few of my videos, but I think that's probably still a little too recent for designers to come up with a really polished alternate build. So instead, we are going back to the previous official set, the McLaren P1. I've actually featured not one but two alternate builds of this set already, and coincidentally both of them were published towards the end of their respective years. In 2024, I showed you the McLaren F1 GTR designed by Donat, who you might also know as the fan designer behind the LEGO Ideas table football set. Then at the end of 2025, we had the Corvette ZR1 created by Tim Go. If we take a look at the Rebrickable page of the McLaren P1 and switch over to the Alt Builds tab, you can see that there still aren't that many large-scale alternatives available. But one of them immediately caught my eye, and it was also the one you requested the most, the McLaren Senna, once again created by Donat. So that's the mock we are taking a closer look at today. As I mentioned, Donat is the fan designer of the LEGO Ideas table football set, but he's also a pretty active designer on Rebrickable. Looking at his profile, you can see that he specializes heavily in alternate builds, and he clearly has a particular interest in larger automotive sets. The Senna is his latest creation, so we rebuilt the P1 to see how well it works. LEGO has actually given us two versions of the McLaren Senna before. The first appeared in Speed Champions, back in the classic 6-stud-wide era, and then we also got the Senna GTR as a member of what I like to call the Technic car transporter gang. The Technic version represented the more extreme GTR, with lots of printed and sticker details, but no transparent side windows. The Speed Champions version did have those. Naturally, there's room for incomparably more detail at 1/8 scale, so let's take a closer look at this one. The McLaren Senna has some seriously complicated surfaces and shapes, and I think this version captures them remarkably well, especially considering the limitations of an alternate build. Starting at the front, we have the huge splitter and those unmistakable headlights. They are represented with flex axles and some light bluish grey elements. It's obviously an interpretation rather than an exact recreation, but the characteristic shape is definitely there. Even the body-colored vertical arrow blades between the headlights and the splitter have been recreated, using a few system pieces to achieve the proper curvature. I especially like this detail because it's such a distinctive part of the real Senna's front end. But there's much more going on here. You have the body line running above the headlights and continuing all the way towards the mirrors, the black section of the hood surrounding those enormous vents, and even the shape of the openings themselves has been carefully recreated. Here's another nice building detail. This curved panel fairing sits above these modified beams to create the central section of the hood. It's a clever solution and works surprisingly well. We also have the hand of God steering knob here. It's removable of course, and we'll come back to the steering in a minute. Moving around to the side, this angled panel fairing is another pretty convincing representation of the bodywork of the real car, including the black section behind it. The beams forming the doors lean inward quite dramatically, just like they do on the real Senna, and of course the transparent lower section of the door is represented as well. If you really want to nitpick, on the real car it's actually the dark section that forms most of the transparent opening, and the shape of the opening itself is slightly different here, but that's really getting into the details. The important thing is that the whole side of the car is made up of extremely complicated angles and overlapping surfaces, and this build manages to recreate the overall appearance very convincingly. I won't say that every panel stays perfectly aligned if you start moving the car around, because there are quite a few sections that need careful positioning, but visually the result is very faithful. Moving back towards the roof, we have the openings here as well, and also the roof-mounted air intake. Behind that, there's an opening where you can see the V8 engine working underneath. And then we reach the rear where once again there's a lot going on. We have the triple exhaust outlets, even the McLaren logo is positioned in roughly the correct place, the rear lights are represented, and underneath there's all the complexity of the diffuser and the surrounding aero elements. The enormous rear wing has its characteristic curvature as well, including the vertical end plates on both sides. Overall, there are tons of recognizable and authentic details packed into this model, and I think that's particularly impressive when you remember that this is still only a B model. The designer was completely limited by the inventory of the original McLaren P1 set. Now let's talk about the functions. The most noticeable one is definitely the door mechanism. The real Senna has these dramatic dihedral doors, and here there's a fairly complex linkage helping the movement. They do occasionally need a little bit of manual guidance, but the mechanism itself is pretty cool and gives the doors an interesting movement. The steering wheel is connected to the front wheels of course, and we also have this removable gear on top for hand-of-God steering. Unfortunately, because of the limited inventory, the gearing isn't ideal. When the car is sitting still, it's almost impossible to turn the wheels using the knob. It works somewhat better while the car is moving, so it's certainly a respectable effort to include the feature, but in practice it's not particularly useful. We have working suspension at both the front and rear. The travel is fairly limited though, especially at the front, so again this is more about having the mechanical feature present than giving the car huge amounts of usable suspension movement. There aren't any other functional opening panels, so the last major feature is the drivetrain. There's a DNR selector in the cabin, together with the familiar pedal shifters behind the steering wheel for changing gears. The 7-speed sequential gearbox is surprisingly compact. As usual with these large Technic supercars though, the actual effect of changing gears is only visible in the speed of the engine pistons, and to see that happening, you need to push this rather substantial car around the table. Realistically, I suspect most people won't be doing that very often. This is the kind of model that's probably going to spend most of its life sitting on a shelf, and for that purpose I think it works very well. The build gives you a proper Technic experience with plenty of unusual connections, tricky angles and solutions that are very different from the original McLaren P1. And at the end, you get a model that looks genuinely different despite using exactly the same inventory. There is one thing you should keep in mind, this is definitely not a playset. If I compare it with Donat's previous P1 alternate, the McLaren F1 GTR, the Senna has much more complicated bodywork and does a better job of recreating all those crazy surfaces of the real car. But the F1 GTR was also a considerably more robust model. Nothing here is randomly falling off if you build it correctly, but there are quite a few relatively fragile bodywork sections. Some parts require very precise alignment, and once you've positioned everything properly, there are definitely areas you probably shouldn't grab when moving the car around. But again, if your main goal is to build it, enjoy the engineering and then put it on display, I don't think that's a major problem. And viewed purely as a display model, I think this is one of the most interesting alternatives currently available for the McLaren P1. So if you already have the P1 and you would like to turn it into a very different McLaren instead of simply rebuilding the original again, I can definitely recommend checking this one out. The instructions aren't particularly cheap, but considering the size and complexity of the model and the amount of work that clearly went into designing it, I think the price is reasonable. And Donat is offering RacingBrick viewers a 20% discount for 1 week using the code RacingBrick. So if you want to give it a try, you will find the link in the description and in the pinned comment. So folks, let me know what you think about this alternate build. Do you think the Senna works better as a 1/8 scale model than the original one? And if you've already built this smoke yourself, I would definitely like to hear about your experience with it. Let's talk about it in the comment section. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe with notifications as more exciting LEGO videos are coming soon. See you next time, bye bye.